I want to recognize that today is Indigenous Peoples Day. And I want to recognize that we are on native lands. And I just want to take a couple breaths and just make that acknowledgement. It's so important for us. Thank you. This also brings to mind the work of Global Santa Fe includes dialogue and diplomacy programs such as this. You can look up talks on the website. We have a lot of exciting ones coming up, which I'll tell you at the end if there's time. But we also do cultural exchange, and we are an implementer of international visitor leadership programs, and also open world programs. IVLP is run through the State Department, and Open World is run through Congress. And we're privileged today to have a group of prosecutors from North Macedonia with us. They are sitting in the back. Raise your hand. And their facilitator and their interpreter, although all of them speak English. If you do hear some mumbling in the back, they're not being rude, they're just catching a little bit of translation help for Mark Pomar's talk, which is really important for us. I also want to say thank you to Collected Works Bookstore, another local partner. You'll have the opportunity at the end of our talk to purchase Mark's book, and he'll even sign it for you. And if for some reason we run out, we know how to get you more, and we can let you know about that. The timeliness of today's talk. Every time I wake up and I think of the talks we have this month, there's something extremely relevant about what speaker we are bringing. And this morning was no different. And I think that also is an explanation for some of the interest in today's talk. The book is Cold War Radio, and we're going to hear about Voice of America and Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. But I want to tell you what a special treat it is to have Mark Pomar here, because he is a very well-known expert on Russia. He and I go back 30 plus years. Back when,
You're only 9 years old.
I don't want to tell you, but it's like 38 years. Mark was my boss, my first boss's boss. He ran Voice of America, the Russia service. Then it was sort of linked to U.S. Information Agency, and it was one of my first jobs in Washington, D.C. And we would bump into each other when I was assigned to the embassy in 1987 and 1988 during Glasnost and Perestroika, during the Gorbachev years, and we were just talking today about how we ran into each other at the commissary. But Mark really can talk a lot about the book and also about what news we're getting every day from Russia, Ukraine, and what's happening on the ground. I will leave that to him to talk about. He's also one of the, in Vermont, I would say he's famous there among Vermonters, because how many are there? I tease him. But he really he has a friend visiting as well. We welcome you from Vermont. But Mark has a bachelor's degree from Tufts University, a PhD from Columbia University. He has a certificate from Harvard, their business school, and in addition to heading the Voice of America Russia service and working for RFE RL, he also worked at IREX, the International Research and Exchanges Board, for many years. He actually hired me to facilitate a conference in the Balkans. No, in Dubrovnik. No, it was Slovenia. That's again how far back we go. We will never be rid of each other. But so he has a lot of experience in that part of the world. He was president of U.S. Russia Foundation in 2008 to 2015. Living in Moscow, and then Putin threw him out, along with U.S. Russia Foundation. So the organization was considered to be undesirable. And so he has not been back, but I'll let him tell you about that as well. I'm just giving you some breadcrumbs so you know what to ask him, although I think questions will not be in short supply. But, you know, when I was at the Russia service, I was in my early 20s, and we were doing preparing bios for, I wanted to say, Chernenko maybe, or something. I don't even know who it would have been back then. But who would have thought that we would find ourselves in this place at this time in history? And I'm not going to say any more. I'm just going to say that we are really pleased to have Mark here. He will be here after for more conversation and to sign books. So without further ado, and I'm sorry if I missed introducing someone, I'll catch you on the close. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Lisa. And indeed, we do go back many years. It's wonderful to see friends. Mark Esquino is an old friend from my USIA days. And Russ Garland, wherever Russ Garland is sitting, who lives here, is my buddy from Burlington High School, class of 1968. I should mention that Russ was our student council president. To Russ. So anyway, I would love to talk to you about the book, but I think before doing anything else, you know, we need to acknowledge that we are facing a horrendous war at the moment. A war that just got uglier just yesterday, or today maybe. Given
Speak a little louder.
You know what?
Yes.
Fonzie, can you just turn it up, please? Would you mind? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I could take this off like this. Is this
Yeah.
helpful? Otherwise, I'm bending over, and that's not very helpful. I was going to say that, you know, any conversation about the Cold War, any conversation about Russia, inevitably we need to talk about what is happening as well. So I thought I'll talk a little bit about the book, but then come back to the war in Ukraine, and maybe in the question and answer we can go back and forth between the historical Cold War and the likely new Cold War that we have entered, and what the nature of that new Cold War could be. I thought it would be proper to start by saying why I decided to write a book. I think any author should sit down, first of all, and decide why they would spend so much time. It is a lot of time. It's focus, concentration, research. And you know, I had the luxury of having retired. I could do nothing. And I thought, no, that wasn't quite what I wanted to do. I thought I would do something interesting. And really, when you hit 70 or so, you kind of look back in your life and you think, what did you see that was really very important or very interesting? And it struck me that all of us, I'd say all of us in the room, experienced one of the great historical events of world history, which is the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the emergence of democracy in Central and Eastern Europe. And I had the privilege of having a front row seat, and in many ways participating in some of the aspects of that Cold
A
War.
little louder, please.
Okay, and
Yeah, we'll do.
I will try to. Is this better? I will try. Don't just tell me if I'm not, if my voice is sinking. Anyway, the idea being that this was such an important event, and as I look back over my many notes and journals that I kept, and I realized that a lot of the meetings that I was part of, a lot of the discussions that were taking place, I was probably the only one left alive who remembers that, because I was young at that point, and I was fortunate to be the youngest kid in the room. And I thought that was important to kind of capture that. So that was really the main reason, was to try to give people a sense of what it was to be a Cold Warrior. And that's who we were, and we're actually very proud of being Cold Warriors. And unlike the military that was there for some impending disaster to respond to, we at Voice of America or at USA, we were involved every single day in doing something, some aspect of it. The other thing that was, I think, very important is that the work turned out to be quite successful. So my second reason for kind of writing a book is to show that American foreign policy can indeed be successful. That we tend as a country to most often focus on things that go wrong. What went wrong in Vietnam, what went wrong in the Iraq War. I mean, we have plenty of examples of things that didn't go right. I wanted to point out something that went right. It also had bipartisan support. that as I looked over, and I did a fair amount of research in terms of his early history of Voice of America, early history of RFE-RL, what was interesting is that every administration from Truman to George H.W. Bush supported the radios. Some more, some less. I'll tell you, the president that least of all supported the radios, I mean, Mark will know immediately who that is, was President Nixon. As a matter of fact, I found a document, which is kind of fun, where Kissinger writes a memo, recently declassified, by the way, top secret, declassified, where he's saying, you know, Mr. President, you have been considering about closing Radio Liberty if we can get the best quid pro quo from the Soviets. Let's see what we can do. And that's in an official memo. They didn't get the quid pro quo, they didn't get what they wanted, Radio Liberty continued. But in 1969, he was on the very, very sort of on the cutting block, chopping block. All the other presidents supported it, some more. Kennedy supported it a lot. Reagan, of course, supported it a lot. But it was a bipartisan effort. It was consistent. It worked. And what's also very interesting in this regard is that we were attacked and maligned in the bad old days, and as glasnost and as perestroika got going, we were more and more accepted. And I can illustrate that with a story that I think might capture just the impact that the radios had during the Cold War and the ending years of the Cold War. When I joined VOA in 1983, the then director of VOA, Ken Tomlin, probably remembers him, came to me and said, you know, there was a very senior advisor to President Carter, a very wealthy guy, I can't remember his name, actually, who felt that in the Reagan years, Americans weren't talking to Soviets enough. That we should have, he wanted to do a dinner and invite young Americans dealing with the Soviet Union to meet with members of the Soviet embassy at his home for a dinner. Would I want to go? And I said, well, I figured it's probably a good dinner, why not go? It was in Old Town, Alexandria. And I came to the dinner, very nice home, beautiful home, and I had, of course, my name and Voice of America, as my name. When the Soviets came in and they saw Voice of America, they all went as far away as they possibly could. They didn't want to be photographed with me, they didn't want to talk to me, they didn't want to see me. They were terrified that they would get into trouble for hanging around and talking. So after a while, I ate food and went home because there was really nothing. So the idea was there was no contact whatsoever between a Voice of America person and the Soviet Union. With Radio Liberty is even worse because a year earlier, I joined in 1982. In 1981, the headquarters of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty in Munich was bombed by, one of the East European security services. And of course, as employees of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, we had to sign a piece of paper that we would not go to the Soviet Union or to Eastern Europe because that would be considered, we would put ourselves in danger. Just to fast forward very quickly, in 1987, mind you, glasnost has already started. It's been about a year and a half of glasnost. Our ambassador, Jack Matlock, then ambassador to the Soviet Union, writes a letter to the Board for International Broadcasting, where I was the executive director, inviting me and another person to come to Moscow to begin the first negotiations about the cessation of jamming. And one thing very quickly to tell you, the Soviet Union jammed VOA, it jammed RFE-RL. What was jamming? It was sending a radio signal on the same frequency so that whatever was being broadcast would be distorted. Mind you, the West never jammed anything out of the Soviet Union. Radio Moscow could broadcast however much it wanted to any place it wanted in the United States. Any American could buy any Soviet newspaper or magazine through the official Soviet store on Fifth Avenue in New York. The Soviet Union played a different game, completely. So we went, two of us, Jack Matlock set out a whole, we had to stay at the embassy, you'll get a clue, because Matlock was convinced that if we stayed in an in-tourist hotel, there might be an unpleasant incident. So he insisted that we stayed in one of the new townhomes on the campus, on the grounds of the embassy. We had a schedule, we went to the first meeting, the person at Gostelradio, the Soviet TV radio, wasn't there, didn't show up, didn't want to meet. We go to another meeting, the secretary tells us, oh, it was called away at the last minute. Finally, by the fourth or fifth meeting, we realized no one in Moscow was going to meet with two representatives of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty in Moscow in 1987. No one. So we spent the rest of the week having a good time, went to the theater, walked around Moscow, and went home. 1 year later, this would be 1988, so you can see the Soviet Union is changing. There's more openness, TV is changing, things are picking up steam. And by the way, the word glasnost that Gorbachev used was in the founding documents of Radio Liberty. Go back to the 1950s, it says, we aim for glasnost. The same, it's an old word, it's a 19th century word. So in many ways, what is glasnost? It's different points of view, it's different ways in which to look at issues. And so we went in '88 as part of the USIA information talks. And by the way, in the book, I have a photograph of my ID saying Moscow 1988 information talks, US delegation. And a completely different change. We sit down with some senior officials, and all of a sudden their first words are, we've noticed an improvement in the programming of Radio Liberty. Which you can immediately know something is going to follow that. Now they had their complaints about this and that and so forth. And literally we walk out and we knew we had prevailed. This was really a monumental change. And my personal feeling was that the officials who were talking to us had no idea what had actually happened in the Soviet Union. It was melting before their eyes. People who had spent their entire life building the Soviet Union and seeing the radios as their #1 enemy were seeing it just disappear before their very eyes. 2 months later, jamming stopped. Radio Liberty opened an office, VOA opened an office. We hired freelancers, and by 1989, when the real change starts happening, you can pick up Radio Liberty and VOA in taxi cabs because we were on AM, we were on FM, we were everywhere. Fast forward quickly to 1991, when the putsch happened, when Gorbachev was in Crimea, or south, I'm not sure, and the party had a basically revolt to bring back the Soviet Union, get rid of glasnost and so forth. What did Gorbachev listen to? He listened to BBC, to Voice of America, to Radio Liberty. Those were the only voices because all Soviet media was obviously under control. In 1991, Yeltsin issued a decree declaring us heroes. To be an American attached to the radios in 1991 in the Soviet Union or in Eastern Europe was to be a hero, was to be mobbed. We had dinners with President Valensa at the Belvedere Palace when the board met there. We were honored by the Hungarian parliament. I mean, we went from being pariahs to being heroes, even though everything we did was the same. What had changed was the country that changed. And so in the book, I try to capture that kind of change. To top it all off, 3 presidents of East European countries headed by Leonard Meri of Estonia nominated Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty for the Nobel Peace Prize in 1991. In 1993, Gorbachev came to the 40th anniversary of Radio Liberty in Moscow, and all kinds of other dignitaries came as well. And we sat around, a bunch of Americans, with Gorbachev talking about how important radio was to his classes and to his programs. So that is the kind of span within 8, 9 years that I worked there, that I witnessed had happened. So I try to capture that in the book in different ways. I try to make the book readable. I tell people if you have to reread a paragraph, I have failed. It should be written in a way that you don't have to read it. And anyway, I hope you don't have to reread it. And so what do I look at? I mean, there have been some books on RFE/RL, some books on VOA, not a lot, but there have been no books that deal with what went on the air. And so most of my book is really an examination of specific programs on human rights, which was a big, big, big issue for the radios. Every day we talked about human rights, whether they were human rights in general, what are they, how are they protected, or if they were human rights that were being violated in the Soviet Union, which of course they were. The Helsinki Accords, which I think was one of the brilliant diplomatic moments in Cold War history. I think an event that everyone should know about, where the Soviet Union basically kind of shot itself in the foot, promoting the Helsinki Accords of 1974 as establishing, sovereignty, that they're going to control Eastern Europe forever, but having Basket 3, which talked about human rights, rights to emigrate, rights to marry whomever you wish, rights to, and so on and so forth, they signed on to, and then that begins the whole dissident movement in the Soviet Union, which says adhere to those rights. So human rights is a very, very big part. I could tell you, I mean, we could go on and on about this, but one interesting moment that maybe you would not have necessarily realized, but VOA did a lot of broadcasting, and so did RL, but VOA in particular, about the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Many dissidents have told me that it was those programs that gave them the idea of holding the Soviet government to what they had claimed to be legal. In other words, there was a sense that, look how the civil rights movement, peaceful, that was the way the dissidents were. They went out, they had signs, they marched, they didn't want to overthrow the government, they were not interested in overthrowing the government, they wanted the government to simply follow the very rules and laws that they themselves had signed. And quite a few of them said we were inspired. Martin Luther King on RL, or Martin Luther King on VOA, or the whole movement in the 60s that we did. So human rights is a big issue. Arts, culture, literature. The Soviet Union, as you may well know, canceled people who crossed certain ideological lines. And so you could be a great writer, but if you were forced to emigrate, or you just sort of disappeared. We tried to give writers, artists, poets, musicians, a chance to be on the radio to talk to their compatriots. And so we had the who's who of the Russian cultural, intellectual world, both on VOA and on Radio Liberty. Just the number of times Mikhail Baryshnikov gave interviews to VOA, when I went back and looked at the records, was just fascinating. Or Brodsky, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature, or Solzhenitsyn, who won the Nobel Prize living in Vermont, on and on. This was the cream of the crop, basically, of Russian intellectual life. Living in the West, had a chance to communicate. So there's quite a lot on arts and culture and literature. There's a chapter on history. As you can imagine, the battles over history, especially at Radio Liberty, were quite intense. Parts of Russian history, Soviet history that was not at all known or was censored became a big part of it. I have a separate chapter on Solzhenitsyn, the writer whom I interviewed and spent 3 days with in Vermont. A very interesting experience in my life. And then a subject, excuse me, that probably very few people know that Radio Liberty and VOA did, and that is religion. We did a lot on religion. We had a separate program on Orthodoxy. We had a separate program on Judaism. We did not do a lot on Islam, which probably was our problem, but we assumed that it would be picked up by a Uzbek service, by a Kazakh service, or by any number of other services that we had in addition to Russian. But we did quite a bit of that. And of course we did it because the Soviet Union was officially an atheist state, that we also felt that religious programming would reach into the rural areas where people had no contact. The dissident movement, the Jewish dissident movement, was very, very much attached to the Jewish programs, which they also felt were, oh, how kind of you, thank you. I have some water, but thank you. And so, a government station funded by all of you taxpayers was really promoting quite a lot of religious programming. I think that, when I looked at that, I thought, wow, this is something that would have, but we did it quite openly within VOA, within USIA. That was not a secret, but I think that it would have been surprising to many people that was the case. Now, obviously, once the Soviet Union fell, there was no need for religious programming and so forth. So this was very specific to the Cold War. So those were the kind of basic points that we did. And I think that what I would probably like to do, I mean, I could go on any number of different points, but I probably would open it up in a few minutes to your questions. But before I do that, I wanted to say why I think some of that was successful. First of all, because we tried to communicate values of what it was to live in a free society. We had a lot of different points of view, and one thing that I found rather frustrating whenever I come across anyone remarking about Radio Liberty or VOA is very often they latch on to some incident that they heard about. It could be a scandal, it could be whatever, and from that they extrapolate that this is what it was. And so I thought that the ignorance behind a lot of that could be somehow dispelled if people actually sat down and looked at what we did. So I tried to do the best you can. There's not a lot of programming available on VOA, but Radio Liberty kept most of its programming online. And you can go back, and if you have the language capability, you can go back and listen to any of these programs and make up your own mind, which is what I think is the right way to do it. But coming to Ukraine, sort of what can we pull out of the Cold War experience? Obviously, we're facing a very different situation. And again, I would illustrate it with a little story that I think is indicative of what we face today. Back in 1982, when I first joined Radio Liberty, I remember going down and sitting down in the cafeteria in the building in Munich with a number of what I would call grizzled dissidents, people who had sat in the gulag, who had been imprisoned, who finally got out, maybe they were traded. Many of them were Jewish refuseniks who had spent years waiting to get out of the Soviet Union, but were harassed and hassled. Anyway, I sat down with them for lunch, young, energetic, enthusiastic, and I'm telling them how, you know, all this conversation I had had with some of the American, with our president, James Buckley, and others about how we should be promoting Russian nationalism, we should be promoting, you know, religion, we should be promoting. And I'm looking at them, and they're looking at me, and I'm totally crazy. So I finally said, you know, what's the matter? And he says, you Americans are even dumber than we thought. He says, you don't understand, they told me, almost in unison. Yeah. The Soviet Union, this is 1982, is dying. The Soviet Union is dying. Nobody believes in communism. No one's going to go out and fight for communism. No one's going to die for communism. And in many ways, I would agree with them. I had spent 1981 as a Fulbright in Leningrad, and I'd never met anybody who had anything but disgust for the Soviet Union. But they told me Russian nationalism is on the rise. That the KGB is thoroughly nationalistic. They don't care about communism, they care about greatness, empire, power. And he says, when these guys come, and what they told me was when Soviet practice and Russian nationalism come together, he says, you Americans are really going to rue that day. 1982, they're absolutely right. Because in many ways, what we have, I mean, in a shorthand in the war, is the recreation of an empire. I mean, think of it, the Russian Empire, Soviet Empire, 1989-91 was the last European empire to crumble, the last European empire decolonized. And it did relatively peacefully. Many of us, I'm sure, Mark, you'll remember many people sitting around in USIA and State Department thinking it might be civil war, there might be attacks. I remember going to some meeting at the NSC and the prognosis was very dire. Like this is, you know, there are 25 million Russians living outside the Russian Federation. They're going to try to bring them back. It didn't happen. It didn't happen because of Gorbachev, it didn't happen because of Yeltsin. Like I say, by some good diplomacy on the part of the US as well to help that process. But basically, they're their decisions. Now we have that delayed, if you want, 30 years of independence, 30 years of Ukraine being a separate country. And it is that practice, that Soviet imperial notion, and bringing the colonies back. And that is what we're witnessing, which is tragic, it is criminal. The other day, I listened to, which is painful to do, but I listened to about half an hour or so of official Russian media, the kind that goes on the air. You can pick it up on the internet in the West very easily. and just the level of hatred, the level of sheer destruction, extermination, words that are used quite freely. You know, we must exterminate people in Ukraine. They are all Nazis, which of course is totally ludicrous and idiotic, but that is the kind of language that is being used, and that is what the war party is pushing. And you know, it goes back to some of the darker periods within the Soviet Union that we dealt with or we saw. I mean, we didn't see quite clearly enough, but it's come back, and I think that a lot of the roots of that, you know, go back to the Cold War. I think it's a more difficult time now than it was for us. In many ways for us in the 80s, life was easier because we were riding a wave of the Soviet Union kind of melting. Now the wave is not with us. We're sort of going against an autocratic, fascist sort of wave, not just in Russia, but in many parts of the world as well. And so I think the task, and I would end by saying, please go on the website of the Agency for Global Media, which oversees oversees VOA, oversees RFE, oversees Radio Free Asia, the radio broadcasting into Iran, and there's a whole set of things that the United States does, which I follow the Russian broadcasts very carefully, and they are superb. I would say, frankly speaking, they're probably better than what we could do in the 80s, partly because they have very, very talented professional journalists today, many of whom have a lot of experience both in country and at BBC and elsewhere. So I would urge you to take a look at that. What I would say, the lessons out of the Cold War, the number one lesson, I think, is that we need to have a foreign policy that is bipartisan, a foreign policy that is not riven with domestic concerns. You know, I remember in the late 1980s going with my then boss, Steve Forbes, to the Hill to meet with congressmen and senators, and we didn't care whether they were Democrat or Republican. Didn't matter to us one bit. We basically got the same reception no matter who it was. Now, there were always the outlier. There were always the fringe types, and they were on the very left, they were on the very right, but we didn't deal with them. They were not that consequential in terms of budgets, in terms of, and by the way, just a little, since he's very famous now, but the person who probably did the most to save the radios in the early 90s, when the Clinton administration came in and wanted to cancel out Radio for Europe, Radio Liberty as a peace dividend, there was one person, and one person alone, who saved the radios. And that was Senator Joseph Biden. So, and I mean, it's a great story. It should be written. I wrote a little bit in an article a few years ago, but he came to our board dinners. He sat down with us. And what's interesting is that he went over and said, look, I'm going to go talk to Jesse Helms, who was then the ranking, the minority. He said, I'll talk to Jesse Helms. We'll work it out. Don't worry. I'll go talk to Bill Clinton as well. And so, yes, indeed, that was the compromise. I mean, there were a lot of compromises. The BBG was created as a result of that. There were certain things that perhaps were not ideal, but by this point was not ideal. It was getting something done that we wouldn't lose. And so I think that was, that was 30-some years ago. But anyway, that's an interesting story that really needs to be told in detail as well. The other thing I would say is that we need, in addition to a bipartisan foreign policy, I think we need a lot of building of alliances. You know, one of the things that I touch on in the book, but maybe don't go into great detail, is how closely Voice of America worked with BBC, with Deutsche Welle, with Radio France International, with Call Israel, with Radio Canada International. I mean, we were like one. I spent several times going to London and spending a week with the BBC just to see what they were doing, how they were doing it, who they were putting on the air, what work. We invited the director of the Russian service of BBC to spend a week at the Voice of America. That was normal, natural interaction so that we would understand, first of all, we would get a better sense of who they thought were better people to invite, because we always looked for who to invite for various programs. There was a lot of cooperation. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty did all the audience research for everyone. They did it for BBC, they did it for Voice of America. They had the bigger operation, and it was just a courtesy done to everyone. So I think that kind of coalition building is very important. And finally, I mean, this is something that I would love to see, is that we become more of a serious country. We're not a very serious country. And we were a serious country, or maybe more serious in the 70s and 80s. I mean, the kind of stuff that is presented as news we would never touch. I mean, we would consider that just garbage to begin with. And now it's all over the place. And so I think that that's a challenge that is much bigger than any of us can do, but that's what we had going for us, and I think that's something that we very much desperately need as a country, to have debates. You know, it's something that we don't have. People yell at each other, but that's not a debate. And we tried, at some of our better programs, you know, you kind of always look back at what really worked well. I think some of the best things we did at The Voice in the 80s is to get two Russians to come and discuss an issue from different points of view, just to give listeners a sense of the complexity of the issue. Let's say it's a historical issue.
I don't think it's you, is it?
So, yeah. I thought I turned it off. So anyway, at that point, I'm trying to adhere to what Lisa told me to do. I will stop, and why don't we have questions and answers?
I know, but we discussed that you might say a few words about the media situation in Russia and what happened to the independent journals, and then we'll take.
Yes. That's actually great. You know, the office that we opened under Gorbachev, that Voice of America opened, the Radio for Europe, Radio Liberty, were finally closed in 2022 by Putin. I mean, they survived all the period from 1989 to 2022. There's now everyone's 100% out. There isn't a single American organization whatsoever in Russia at all. There were many NGOs, there were many universities. Middlebury College had a campus, Stanford had a campus, and all kinds of, Bard College had a very good program in St. Petersburg. All that's gone. And of course, in the media, only the voices that are extremists, as I mentioned earlier, are there. It is 100% control of the little independent media that existed in Russia, radio, TV, or TV Rain, Echo of Moscow, have been pushed out. By the way, very smartly, Radio Liberty hired most of those people, and so they're sitting in the Baltics, but continuing in many ways the work that they did. The Congress, if you can believe it, wisely gave extra money for that very recently, which I think is a sign of, very positive sign that doesn't always come out of Congress, but it did. So I think there is that sense, but it's very hard to get in. I start my day usually by watching either something called Current Time, which is a joint Voice of America, Radio Liberty program. It's in Ukrainian, and a separate one in Russian. And it's something that, you know, back in my days, you know, the radios kept pretty far apart. Now they work together. So VOA provides the American perspective, the American interviews. Radio Liberty picks up its freelancers in Ukraine, in Europe, and so forth. So there's that cooperation. It's one program called Current Time, which is also available on the internet. You can just go on, click it, and watch it. And it's very, very extensive, careful, thoughtful program. So beyond that, any questions? Yes, please.
How does the internet, in its sort of octopus quality, how has it affected and driven so much of this? Or are there forces out there on the internet that are helping to undrive it, this hate?
Can you repeat the question also for background?
How is the internet impacting media positively, negatively, that kind of?
Especially in relationship with Ukraine. And
Yes. Well, thank God for YouTube, because most of the programs that we do here, I mean, what Radio Liberty does or VOA goes on YouTube. And the Russians have not closed YouTube up, primarily because it's very popular, apparently, within Russia for all kinds of other reasons. So that is still one way. There are all kinds of things that are beyond my knowledge of technology, but there's like a mirroring that if you close it off, it remirrors and you can pick it up. And there are all kinds of instructions that when you go on the sites, how to avoid being closed down. So the techie types can get around the censorship, but there is quite a bit, and I think there'll be more as time goes on. I mean, it's not quite what jamming was, but it's along the same lines.
More broadcasting or more censorship?
There will be more censorship in Russia trying to block any kind of voice coming from outside, but I think there are neat ways in which to get around that. Plus, there are all these telegram channels that the Russians do that then you can pick up here and then you can rebroadcast. Remember, this is the most broadcast war of all time. No war, I think, in history has ever had this much documentation on all kinds of levels from so many sources. And so I think it's hard to block all of that out. It just comes in different ways. I mean, when I lived in Russia, Moscow was a pretty modern city. I mean, people had, I mean, you could sit in the Moscow metro and look at internet because they had so much connectivity in the metro that we didn't have in the States. So they're not that far behind. I know they obviously want to control it, but the technology is there. They're pretty good at that. So let's hope it continues. Yes, sir.
In our local newspaper this morning, in your op-ed, you used the term war party. Could you explain that a little bit in depth?
Yes, I use it in
Consists of
quotes
war
because
party.
it's not an official
I
self-proclaimed
understand
war
that,
party.
what's it-
But there is a rather sizable group, both within the government, within what's called the power ministries, and especially unofficial media, RT and the local Russian media, that advocate a very harsh, as I said earlier, approach to Russia's war. They are complaining that Putin is too mild. They're complaining that Russia is not bombing enough. They're complaining that they're not tough enough. And you know, you could trace them back to the 1990s. You know, we always say, oh, the Cold War is over, but for a sizable, maybe not a majority, of course, but a sizable portion of the Russian political elite never accepted the end of the Cold War. They just went into abeyance of some sort, you know. And they continued. You look at articles being written in the very far-right publications in the 90s and early 2000s, and you see a very, very virulent anti-Western, anti-American, everything that has to do with the weakening of Russia. And so they've now, this is their day. They have a heyday. They can be on and spout whatever they want. They used to be on talk radio. When I lived in Moscow, I had a driver. We drove into the city in traffic, and so I listened to talk radio. And there was quite a bit of what I would call that kind of talk radio, but we always thought it was marginal and it wasn't going to really affect government policy. They are now government policy.
So as a follow-up, what's the flip side? Is there any type of organized dissonance to what Putin is trying to do?
Dissent?
Is there any,
Dissent?
Yeah.
do you have opposition that can effectively push him out or overturn him?
Well, you probably know that, well, hundreds of thousands of people are leaving all the time. So just in the first 5 days
They
of
got their draft
mobilization.
notices. Our people went to Canada during those days.
Well, but not at this level. Not at this level. And plus you've had millions of people emigrate from Russia over the last 10 years. In Canada, in Australia, in Europe. I mean, London is known as Londongrad. I mean, there's so much Russian spoken. They have their own newspapers, their own radio stations, their own.
Are there enough people at the highest levels that can ditch this guy? And do they have the oomph to do it?
Okay, let me answer it in another way.
I just asked a
The
question.
Politburo in the Soviet Union actually had members who had some standing within the country because they control certain parts of industry, they control certain important regions. And the General Secretary, Gorbachev, had to contend with, now he tried to change them, we tried to bring in people who were like him, but he had opposition within the Politburo. After Stalin, it was in quotes, a cooperative leadership. What Putin has constructed is a one-man dictatorship. So everybody around him is there only because he has allowed them to be and to steal and live a good life and whatever else. They have no independent power base outside of the Kremlin. And that was something that it took him 20 years to build. I mean, if you go back and look at the decisions he took in the early 2000s by closing down independent media, by arresting oligarchs who thought they could be more powerful, Mr. Khodorkovsky first and foremost in 2004. And so you have these people who are nominally the head of something, but they don't have any stature to go out and sort of be a political figure in and of their own right. And so that makes it much more dangerous. So he falls, they go with him. They don't want to go down with him, and so they cling to it. It's brittle, but it could fall apart. How it will fall apart, I have no idea. I mean, it could be an internal coup that might be a military, maybe people in the military will rise up against it. You know, there's an interesting incident right before the war. A prominent Russian general, retired, went on YouTube and went on to give an interview in which he said it's ridiculous. His name was Ivashov, General Ivashov. He's saying it was ridiculous to even think of attacking Ukraine. And plus he said, I've been negotiating with NATO for years and they're nice guys and we come to agreements. I don't understand what this problem, NATO's not gonna attack us. What is the problem? Now they shut him up pretty quickly. All of a sudden there's another president of this organization. But there are people in the military who see it as you know, destroying their country. So there might be in the military some opposition, but I'm not sure. They keep switching generals every couple of weeks anyway, so I'm not sure about it. Yes?
How are your thoughts on the possibility of ending the Second Cold War? How long do you think it could stretch out? What would need to have, what would have to happen in order to end it soon?
Well, it depends on how you define it, and I thought that's I would say, this is just my off the top of my head thought, that this Cold War is not obviously a war of communism versus capitalism. No, neither China nor Russia are interested in giving up money and property and goods and so on. It's sooner one of authoritarian versus democratic societies. Fascism versus a kind of liberalism. That's more the divide, and that divide is not geographic. That divide is all over the place. It's partly in this country, partly in Europe, partly elsewhere. So if it's a Cold War, it's a Cold War that's much more complicated, I think, than what we experienced in the 70s and 80s. I don't know how it's going to develop, and I think this is something that's going to be a big, big challenge. So I agree with the notion that, you know, democracy is under assault in a lot of places. There seems to be a growing fascination with strongmen and authoritarian rule, which is very dangerous. And in many ways, the war in Ukraine is that conflict because Ukraine has a very vibrant civil society, and I think its dream is to be like Poland or like the Czech Republic and be part of Europe and kind of come under EU and live within this umbrella of European standards and European norms and so forth. That's their goal. I think they would vote overwhelmingly for that. So the war is not just decolonization. It's kind of where will if Russia takes over Ukraine, that's going to be a big win for the appeal of authoritarian rule.
I have another question.
Yes.
Could you tell us more about Alexander Dugin and why he is so important as an advisor and his historical, spiritual awareness?
Okay, maybe, I mean, this is a question about Alexander Dugin. You may have read that his daughter died or was killed in a car bombing a few weeks ago. Yeah. In a nutshell, what to say about Alexander Dugin? He is a geostrategist of some sort who believes in land empires versus water empires. And his basic point is that Anglo-Saxons, whom they hate, Putin actually uses that term, Anglo-Saxons are like the enemy, the ultimate enemy of the Anglo-Saxons, English speaking, because they are the water empire. We, Russia, are the land empire. And so Eurasia is the largest land mass. And and so Eurasia must come together under Russian leadership to oppose the water empire that otherwise is. That's in a nutshell as I know it. And there was some crazy British guy, the name I can't remember, who also wrote about water empires back 100 years ago. So he must have dug this stuff up someplace. But why is he dangerous? I don't think he's as dangerous as probably people make him out to be. Is that he is pushing part of the war party that you mentioned. He's pushing the creation of this Russian Eurasian civilization that will be the heart of the land empire that will then bring together all the different peoples in Eurasia under its. Of course, what he doesn't realize is China, which I'm sure has no interest whatsoever in being part of anything. But that's in a nutshell as I understand Alexander Dugin. I haven't spent a ton of time reading a lot of him, but that's. I will tell you a funny story. Some guy in Texas, some Texan, wealthy Texan, decided that Texas A&M needed to hear Dugin's lecture, and so he arranged for Dugin over Zoom to give a lecture at Texas A&M about land and water empires, which I read about in the local Texas newspaper, which I thought was about the craziest idea I'd ever heard. But anyway, what? Yeah, they seem to like it anyway. But that's kind of fringe. We always considered him, people who don't, as just endless fringe. I mean, Russia had, beginning in 1991, once there was no censorship, immediately you had a very far-right Russian political orientation. Immediately. And it was very extreme. We just thought, well, every country has extremes, and everyone does. So we know, well, it's a small extreme, it's going to go away, who cares about it? But it's grown and grown and grown. And so that's really, he comes right out of that from the 1990s.
Would it be fair to consider him a kind of Cyrillic his writings, a kind of Cyrillic Mein Kampf?
Oh, I don't know. I haven't, to be honest with you, read Mein Kampf. But anyway, I think probably he would be happy to be put in that category, yes, as a kind of Russian opposition to it. But there's interesting, those of you who may have watched Putin's speech last week, I think, when he announced the annexation of the 4 territories of Ukraine, he quoted only one person. And the person he quoted is someone called Ivan Ilyin. And Ivan Ilyin is a very interesting figure because he's closer to what you're saying. There's a fascinating professor of history at Yale called Timothy Snyder, whose books I would recommend. Tim Snyder has written quite a bit about Ivan Ilyin. You can find quite a few articles. Ivan Ilyin was a Russian emigre living in Germany and then Switzerland, who really embodies a kind of European fascism of the 20s and 30s. Not necessarily Nazi, but kind of a Mussolini fascism, a kind of Portuguese fascism, Franco-fascism. I mean, a sort of a thinker along those lines. He has a very famous, he very much advocated that for a post-communist Russian government. And the reason I got to know Mr. Ilyin was there were a couple of people at Radio Liberty, old timers, who liked him, so they wanted to put him on the air, and he was controversial, so I ended up in 1982, 83, actually reading a fair amount about him, but I'm thinking of him as a marginal figure, as a guy who died in emigration in 1949, sort of forgotten. Lo and behold, he has come back to Russia as a hero. He's been reburied in Moscow with honors. And he's the only person that Putin quoted in a major speech last week. If you look at Ilyin's writings, and some of them have been translated, but Timothy Snyder does a pretty good job of sort of summarizing it, because he wrote a lot on different things. He is your kind of ideological thinker of what an autocratic regime should be like. He has a famous statement, which I always find kind of curious. He said, the purpose of voting is to show public allegiance to the leader. That is a direct quote of what voting is. Voting is to show public allegiance to the leader. It doesn't supposed to decide anything. God forbid that you actually count those votes. But that is I'm quoting him word for word. That is considered Putin's favorite philosophy. Now, what does that mean? Now, I've also been told by friends of mine in Russia that Ilyin's works are now required in military schools to be read. They are required for civil servants to be read. Not all of them, but certain excerpts from that. So that is something to watch for in terms of the orientation. And the school curriculum in Russia is very strictly controlled by the government. You can only say this, but you can't say that. You can only use this book, but you can't use that book. Things that were different in the 90s. I mean, in the 90s, Russians used textbooks from anywhere. They were very free. That's all disappeared. If there was a question, sir. Yeah.
As we mentioned earlier, we just came back from Uzbekistan, Central Asia.
You guys are great, yeah.
But you know, the colonies were really interesting. We were with the government. They were quite outspoken. We learned how to coexist with Russia, but we are starting to get a little afraid of them.
Yeah.
But you know, we actually are more worried about the other stance, so to speak. They were scared to death of China, which was interesting. Okay, and so there's a love-hate relationship going among all those people. And you know, the net result was they said, you know, we hope Russia starts fixing the colonies because the colonies are starting to fall apart now.
So did they want Russian involvement, or they didn't want Russian involvement?
They wanted to maintain the trade, but still be independent. And they, you know, so they were, you know, they felt that Ukraine and NATO was partially to blame. They didn't say it was, you know, all clear what started, but they were certainly saying this is wrong. You know, we got to fix this because it's going to come down and whip all of us into shape eventually.
Well, Uzbekistan is a curious one because they've had a much harsher rule than Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan. So now you realize these are all artificial borders that Stalin drew. I mean, they have nothing to do with anything to do with, you know, these tribes and these various peoples and so forth. It's all kind of. Yeah, I think they're really in a tough place because China sees them as resources, not very heavily populated areas with tremendous resources and minerals and oil and all kinds of other things. And Russia sees them as part of their empirical, you know, Tashkent and others came under the Russian Empire in the 18th century, right? In the early 19th century. So it's been part of that for a long time.
We have time for just one more question, sorry, and then two more questions.
You mentioned Moscow as being very cosmopolitan. My question is, are the Russian people hurting at all? Or, you know, they suffered during the Cold War, but what's going on there now?
Well, you can't recognize, I went to the Soviet Union for the first time in 1973, and it was like landing on the moon. Moscow, circa 2010, 2011, was a modern world-class city with every conceivable fancy store and fancy restaurant and malls that are no different than our malls in the United States. And the largest Ralph Lauren store in the world was in downtown Moscow. I mean, that kind of stuff. That's probably all, I haven't been back in a few years, but that's probably been closed down because of sanctions. Starbucks are gone, McDonald's are gone, but that was big stuff, and it was very much. So yes, it had a lot of Marriott, it had 7 or 8 Marriott hotels just in Moscow. Ritz-Carlton, St. Regis, everything was there. You know, that's the way it was.
Hey, I want to ask you a question about the future of radio broadcasting. And you had mentioned the U.S. Agency for Global Media, and of course, that was the successor of the Broadcast Board of Governors. And that organization went through a bad time during the last administration under an ideologue by the name of Michael Pack. And I for full disclosure, I was part of a State Department inspection of U.S. AGM. The report has not come out, probably this week. I would love to talk with you about the report, but that's not my question. What is the future of U.S. AGM? As you said, RFE, RFL have now gotten support from Congress, but U.S. AGM also has a brand new director in Bennett. And are you optimistic that there is a future for both the VOA and Cuban Broadcasting, which are part of government agencies, and then for the surrogates? Where do we go from here?
Well, that's, of course, we could spend the rest of the evening discussing possibilities. I think their task is more important than ever. So I think what they're doing is extremely important. Whether the organization of it makes any sense, that's a whole different question.
Yeah.
Because you're talking about an organizational structure, and whether there's duplication. I think you get away from duplication precisely by the current time model, where one picks up one part of it, the other picks up the other part, no one is stepping on each other's toes, and together they create a program that has coherence and has standards. So that's a very good direction to go in. But I think it would be, most of the people I know in the, quote, radios, they're no longer just radios, they do a lot of TV and so on, feel that there really should be a reevaluation of the whole structure, maybe with a blue ribbon commission that would sort of set out a vision of how you better organize it, rather than having this hodgepodge of organizations that you've just collected historically over time, and you just put them all in one group. But that would require an administration willing to expend the time and money and effort to do that. But yeah, it probably, I think you could make the case that and maybe there are other technologies that you could weave into that as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Really, I know that we could all spend hours listening to him and getting our questions answered. It's a big topic and has been for decades. But I want to tell you three things. One is that if you like this talk, and you heard a lot about democracy under fire, we do have a Democracy Under Fire series that we are launching for the remainder of 2022 and into 2023. Later this month, we have Professor Ko, who will be our Judge Case lecturer on international law, who actually represented Ukraine in Ukraine versus Russia in the International Criminal, I get it wrong every time.
ICC.
ICC. So he will be speaking at the end of the month. We also have authors Peter Baker and Susan Glasser, who just came out with a book called Trump the Divider, who will look at global issues and foreign policy during that administration, looking ahead as well. We also have Jeremy Suri, who is an academic who will, he's very well known and a friend of Mark Pomar's as well. He will be at Collected Works Bookstore, and also at, we'll have a lunch at, I think it's La Fonda, right, Susan? So that's the first thing I want to tell you. The second thing I want to tell you is that if you go on globalsantafe.org, we remember changed our name, don't go .com quite yet, but .org, you can see the events that we have coming up. We have a number of additional talks. We also, in addition to the International Exchange Program, thank you again to our Macedonian guests for joining us. I look forward to hearing your views of what you heard throughout the week that you're here with us. But we also have a student engagement program. We have student fellows from high schools all across New Mexico. And this is an important part of the work that Global Santa Fe does. What does it mean to be a global citizen? What does it mean to hear diverse perspectives and form your own opinions? What does it mean to interact with visitors from other countries and hear their opinions of what's happening in the world? So I always like to make this point that beyond our talks, Global Santa Fe is quite active in any number of ways. And my third point is that I do want to thank Susan J. and Kimberly and and my partner Naira, who's always ready to jump in the car and collect anybody who may need to join us. But with that, Mark has agreed to sign books, sell his books outside, so I invite you, our Collected Works Bookstore colleagues will help facilitate that. Please come and find us or email me anytime. If you get our weekly digest, if you don't, you should sign up. There's updates all the time as people come through town. So you can sign up for the newsletter. It comes out generally Wednesdays and Thursdays, tells you what's coming, or you can email me directly. If you have an idea of a program or a book you want to have us feature, we'll do our best. And thank you again for coming out tonight. Thank you.